They came to steal his land, burn his legacy, and erase his name from history. But what they didn't know was that he was a Delta Force legend. What happened next would turn a quiet farm into a battleground that shook an entire town. If you care about justice, legacy, and the power of one man to lead a movement, you need to watch this to the end. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because this story is going to leave a mark. The sun rose slowly over the rolling fields of Hollow Ridge, casting a warm amber light across the land that had been in Malcolm Reed's family for generations. The early morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and dew, and the sound of birds calling from fence posts and power lines. Malcolm stood on the porch of his farmhouse, holding a mug of black coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon as if listening to the land itself. To most, he was just a quiet, aging farmer living a simple life on a patch of soil tucked away from the noise of the world. But beneath the calm exterior was a man with a history no one could read on his face. Malcolm had once served in the elite Delta Force. He'd seen things, done things, that most couldn't imagine. Yet here he was, back where it all began, tending to the land his grandfather had once picked cotton on, then later bought outright with the calloused hands of hard-earned freedom. Life in Hollow Ridge moved at its own pace. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where neighbors waved from their trucks, and Sundays were reserved for church and sweet tea on the porch. Malcolm liked it that way. It was quiet, peaceful. But in recent weeks, that peace had started to shift. It began with something small, a truck he didn't recognize creeping past the end of his driveway. No plates. Blacked-out windows. It didn't stop, just rolled on slow like it was watching, then vanished into the trees. Malcolm saw it once. Then again. By the third time, he didn't chalk it up to coincidence anymore. Something was off. Then came the flyer. Just after sunrise, while walking the eastern fence line, he spotted it flapping against a post, caught in the wire like the wind had delivered it with purpose. The paper was thick, the print bold, and the message ugly. It talked about preserving heritage, protecting the homeland, and buried beneath the words was the faint image of a burning cross. There was no name, no contact, just fear disguised as patriotism. Malcolm didn't say a word. He folded it quietly, tucked it into his back pocket, and kept walking. A few hours later, Pastor Carter showed up. He was one of the town's most trusted voices, an elder with kind eyes and a quiet strength. He didn't waste time with small talk. He'd seen the same flyers, pasted to the church doors like some sort of declaration. Malcolm wasn't the only one being targeted. Other black families, old Miss Irene, the Walkers, the Harrisons, had all received them. Some had even gotten late-night visits. Lights flashing through windows. Knocks that never came with a face. It was clear this wasn't random. It was coordinated. Malcolm listened, jaw tight, saying little but feeling everything. He'd lived through enough to know when something was coming. And this was just the beginning. The way you can feel a storm rising through your boots before the sky turns dark. That evening, he walked the land again, tracing the fences, checking every post and path. By the pond, he noticed something wrong. One of his horses was missing. Sweet Bay. The gate had been tampered with, clean, deliberate. Not the work of an animal. Malcolm stood there a long time, not angry, not scared. Just still. Watching. Calculating. Preparing. He hadn't come back to this land to fight another war. But he would if he had to. Because this land wasn't just soil. It was memory. It was family. It was home. And no one was going to take it without a fight. Sunday mornings in Hollow Ridge usually carried a kind of gentle rhythm. Church bells ringing in the distance, birds calling out from trees still heavy with mist, and the smell of fresh biscuits drifting from kitchen windows. But that morning felt different. Heavier somehow. Malcolm Reed stepped out onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, scanning the fields like he always did, but his eyes lingered longer on the dirt road that curved through the trees. Something had shifted in the air. Something he couldn't quite explain, but he could feel it in his bones. It didn't take long for the silence to be broken. 3 trucks rolled up the hill, their engines rumbling louder than necessary, like they were trying to announce themselves before even stepping out. The lead truck, white with blacked-out windows, was the same one Malcolm had seen creeping past his gate all week. Now it was here, and it hadn't come alone. Gravel crunched under oversized tires as the vehicles came to a stop at the edge of his property, and 6 men climbed out slowly, spreading out like they owned the place. Their faces were rough, eyes narrow and sharp with the kind of swagger that came from thinking no one would push back. At the center of the group was a man Malcolm recognized even though they'd never spoken, Darrell Hayes. He carried himself like someone used to getting what he wanted. Tall, lean, with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped forward casually, hands loose at his sides, trying to play it friendly, but there was nothing neighborly about the way his crew flanked him. They were there to intimidate, not talk. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. He just stood firm at the top of the porch steps, his presence calm but unshakable. Darrell introduced himself and started talking, about tradition, about keeping the town peaceful, about offers and opportunities. It was all dressed up in polite words, but the message underneath was clear: leave or suffer the consequences. Malcolm listened quietly, letting him speak, watching his movements, noting the way one of the younger men at the back kept shifting his weight, glancing around nervously. They were trying to size him up, to see if he would bend. When Malcolm made it clear the land wasn't for sale, the tone shifted. The false pleasantries faded fast. Darrell's words grew sharper, heavier with insult. He tried to paint Malcolm as unreasonable, ungrateful, even lucky to get an offer at all. And when that didn't work, the threats became less subtle. Things like fire, missing animals, accidents. All framed like casual advice from one neighbor to another, but Malcolm heard the truth in every word. Still, he didn't budge. He met Darrell's eyes without blinking and told him what needed to be said. The land wasn't going anywhere. Not to them. Not to anyone. The air between them tightened. Darrell stepped closer, his jaw clenched, the bravado slipping just enough to show the frustration underneath. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't need to yell or threaten back. His quiet strength spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. Eventually, Darrell backed off, snapping his fingers to signal his men. They climbed back into their trucks, grumbling and casting one last round of hateful glances toward the house. Engines roared back to life, tires spun up clouds of dust, and in a matter of seconds, they were gone. But they didn't leave in peace. They left with unfinished business hanging in the air. Ava stepped out a moment later, joining Malcolm on the porch. Her eyes scanned the retreating vehicles, then settled on his face. He didn't have to say anything. She knew what was coming. That visit wasn't a one-time thing. It was a test. And now that they'd been denied, they'd be back, with more fire, more anger, and fewer words. That night, Malcolm didn't sleep. He stayed up walking the perimeter, checking every lock, every fence post, listening to the wind in the trees and the creak of old boards. At some point before dawn, he spotted smoke. A glow on the edge of his land. The barn. The flames licked the sky fast, too fast to stop. The heat hit like a wall. Ava rushed out, calling his name, but he caught her in his arms and held her back. It was too late. They'd made their next move. By sunrise, the barn was ash. The fields smelled like smoke and loss. But in the middle of the ruins stood Malcolm, shoulders square, eyes set, the fire behind him but not inside him. Not yet. What Darrell and his men didn't understand was that some roots run too deep to pull out with fear. Some men don't run. They rise. And that was the mistake they made. They thought they could scare him into silence. But they only reminded him how to fight. The morning after the fire, Malcolm Reed stood in the smoldering remains of his barn with ash settling softly on his boots like snow. The structure that once held tools, feed, and memories had been reduced to blackened beams and smoke that still drifted across the fields. The damage was more than physical. It was a message, a challenge, and a reminder of exactly what he and his community were up against. But where some might have felt fear, Malcolm felt something else, a clarity that came not from anger, but from purpose. He had spent his whole life preparing for moments just like this, even if he never expected to face it in his own backyard. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, neighbors began arriving at Malcolm's driveway. Some came in silence, others with questions in their eyes. People who had lived nearby for decades, some with weathered hands and stories that stretched back to the days of segregation, stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at the ruin. There was sorrow, yes, but something else lingered beneath it. A spark. Malcolm saw it in their faces. Tired of being scared. Tired of whispers. Tired of watching their homes, their lives, their legacy being pushed to the edge by people who thought they didn't belong. Pastor Carter came first, followed by old Miss Irene, then families like the Walkers and the Harrisons. Jordan Lane, a 17-year-old with fire in his eyes, arrived with his little sister in tow, refusing to be left behind. As the crowd gathered, Malcolm stepped forward. He didn't give a speech. He just spoke from his heart. Calmly. Clearly. And everyone listened. They began to move. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was steady and focused. They cleared what was left of the barn, set up temporary fencing, and laid plans to secure every property line in the area. Malcolm brought out maps, walkie-talkies, and handwritten schedules from inside the house. He divided the area into zones. He paired the elders with the younger ones. Everyone had a role. Even the children were taught to whistle in patterns if something seemed off. Jordan and a handful of other teens took to the training quickly. Malcolm worked with them one-on-one, teaching them to track movement in the grass, to spot fresh footprints in the dirt, to listen for the unnatural silence that often came before trouble. They practiced communication signals and how to stay calm in high-stress moments. Jordan's hands were clumsy at first, but his focus never wavered. By the end of the day, he could sweep a perimeter like a young soldier. The neighbors started rotating shifts, some walking the fences during the day, others watching the roads at night. They reinforced gates, repaired broken lights, and added alarm bells made from old tin cans and wire. Every house kept a radio. Every vehicle was fueled and parked facing the road, ready to move if needed. It wasn't about becoming soldiers. It was about becoming watchful, aware, and unwilling to be victims. Ava played her part too. While Malcolm trained and organized, she kept everyone grounded. She made food, packed water jugs, and created a quiet space where the elders could rest and where the children felt safe. Her calm was like a soft breeze through the tension. Just her presence reminded people why they were doing all this. Not just to fight, but to protect, to preserve, to stay rooted. Evenings became meeting times. The community gathered around Malcolm's porch, sharing what they saw, what they feared, what they hoped. Lena Morris, the local journalist, showed up with a notepad and sharp eyes. She didn't interrupt. She observed, asked thoughtful questions, and listened. She was the first to call it what it really was, a campaign of hate, organized and funded, meant to break them down one by one. Malcolm nodded. He already knew. But now others were starting to say it out loud. That acknowledgement changed things. What started as fear began turning into fire, into unity. Families who had once felt isolated now stood together. They saw each other not just as neighbors but as one body, one voice. And with Malcolm at the front, not leading with rage, but with quiet purpose, they began to believe they could hold the line. As the sun set behind the ridge each night, the fields no longer felt vulnerable. They felt guarded, prepared, not with weapons, but with people who had decided that this land, this life, this history, was worth protecting. Malcolm looked out over the field from his porch, the moonlight catching the edge of a freshly built fence. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The resistance had already begun. The days after the fire felt heavy, not just from the ash that still clung to the wind, but from the growing realization that this wasn't just about one family's land. The attacks weren't isolated. They were coordinated, deliberate, and part of something far more sinister than most had imagined. The signs had been there all along, the same trucks showing up at different farms, the same flyers posted at churches, the same kind of damage and intimidation at black-owned properties across the county. But it took Lena Morris to start connecting the dots. Lena had grown up in Hollow Ridge. She knew the quiet ways the town operated, how things were often kept hush behind closed doors, how the past was something folks nodded at but rarely spoke about. She'd left years ago to study journalism, digging into stories that most people were too afraid to touch. And when she heard what had happened to Malcolm Reed's farm, she didn't just come back to visit. She came back to investigate. What started as a few interviews turned into hours of digging through county records, old deeds, and zoning files. Lena worked out of a makeshift office in the back of the feed store, surrounded by boxes of documents, a laptop, and a wall covered in names, maps, and photos. One morning, she showed up at Malcolm's farm holding a thick folder and a look on her face that said she'd seen too much to keep it to herself. Inside the folder were property deeds, some old, some recently altered. The names had changed. Signatures didn't match. In some cases, entire families who still lived on the land had already been listed as transferred in county files. Lena had traced those transfers back to a holding company registered out of state. On paper, it looked legitimate. But a closer look revealed the truth. The documents were forgeries, the signatures fake, the transfers illegal. And the same name kept appearing again and again in the background: Sheriff Alan Drake. He wasn't just failing to protect the community. He was helping erase it. Lena's research showed that the Red Thorns weren't acting alone. They were the muscle. The ones who showed up in the night to scare people into silence. But behind them were lawyers, investors, and officials who stood to profit if those families left. The county had recently approved funding for a massive development project, a new highway, commercial lots, infrastructure upgrades. And every inch of it would run right through the farmlands that black families had spent generations building. Malcolm listened quietly as Lena laid it all out. The conspiracy wasn't just about race, it was about money, power, and control. It was about erasing people from the land so that others could build something shiny and new in their place. They were betting that nobody would notice, that nobody would care, that fear would do the work for them. But now the truth had a name, a face, and a voice. And Lena wasn't the only one speaking up. Other farmers started checking their records. They began comparing letters, notes, even strange visitors who had come by with low offers and high pressure. The pattern was clear. And it wasn't just Malcolm's land at stake, it was everyone's. That same afternoon, while Jordan and a few others were reinforcing the south fence, they found another flyer. Tucked under a rock, meant to be seen. Only this time, the words were more direct. They weren't asking anymore. They were warning. Lena snapped a photo, folded the paper, and added it to her growing file. The Red Thorns were escalating. That meant they were desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Lena began preparing a report, not just for a local paper, but for national media. She had names, dates, documents, photos, and recordings. Everything needed to expose the full scope of the operation. Malcolm gave her his full support, offering whatever she needed, even when it meant risking more attention. Because once the truth started to come out, there'd be no putting it back in the shadows. As evening fell, the fields around Malcolm's farm were quiet again, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of fear. It was a focused calm, the kind that comes before a storm, when you know the next move is yours to make. The community was no longer just responding. They were preparing, watching, planning. And now, with Lena's investigation in motion, the people who thought they could take everything without consequence were finally going to be seen. It started like any other evening patrol. Jordan Lane and 3 other teens made their way through the southern fields just before dusk, moving along the fence line the way Malcolm had trained them. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and gold, the air soft and calm. Spirits were high, despite everything. They laughed a little, kicked at stones, and passed a canteen of warm water between them. For a few moments, it felt like maybe things were settling. Maybe all the preparation had been enough to keep the worst away. But hope has a way of being tested. As they neared the edge of the woods, just past the old irrigation ditch, Jordan froze. He heard a sound, a soft, unnatural snap, almost too quiet to notice. His hand shot up in warning, and the others stopped in their tracks. He saw it then, glinting faintly in the fading light, a trip wire stretched low across the weeds. Before he could say a word, there was a loud pop. Then 2 more in quick succession. Smoke canisters erupted around them, filling the air with thick, choking clouds. Eyes burned. Throats closed. The teens scattered, coughing and blinded, struggling to make sense of the chaos. Out of the haze came shadows. Men in masks with bats and chains, rushing forward like ghosts given form. Jordan ducked just in time to miss a swing aimed at his head. He rolled, scrambled, kicked, and shouted for the others. The air was thick and hot, the sounds of struggle barely cutting through the confusion. Somewhere nearby, one of his friends was hit hard and went down. Another screamed. Jordan's heart pounded as he turned to face the next attacker, only to be struck hard in the forearm by a wooden bat. Pain shot through him, but he didn't fall. Then, through the smoke, came movement. Faster, stronger, deliberate. It was Malcolm. He moved like a storm, cutting through the chaos with the sharp, controlled movements of a man who had spent a lifetime in battle. He didn't shout or waste time. One by one, he disarmed the attackers with quiet precision, turning their aggression against them. A wrist twist here, a knee strike there, a shove that dropped a man without a word. His presence alone shifted the energy of the fight. The gang wasn't prepared for someone like him, not just trained, but calm, centered, and absolutely unwilling to lose. Jordan watched, still dazed, as Malcolm moved through the smoke like a protector born from the land itself. But even Malcolm couldn't do it alone. One man got behind him and landed a blow to the ribs, hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Blood bloomed on Malcolm's shirt, but he stayed on his feet. Another attacker lunged, and this time Jordan stepped in, swinging a thick branch into the man's side with all the strength he had left. The man dropped. When the smoke finally cleared, the teens were bruised and shaken, but alive. One had a busted lip, another limped on a twisted ankle, and Jordan's arm throbbed with every heartbeat. But none of them ran. They stood shoulder to shoulder, panting, alert, watching the last of the attackers retreat into the woods. Word of the attack spread fast. Within the hour, families started showing up at Malcolm's farm. No one waited for an invitation. They came with first aid kits, flashlights, casseroles, and quiet determination. Parents wrapped their arms around trembling teens. Elders offered words of comfort, but their eyes burned with a deeper kind of anger. Not rage. Resolve. That night, the entire community gathered in what remained of the old barn, now converted into a planning center. Malcolm stood at the front with Lena and Pastor Carter beside him. No one shouted. There were no demands. Just the quiet, collective understanding that enough was enough. The attack on the teens had crossed a line. It wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't even about power. It was about survival. About dignity. About the future they were building together, one night patrol at a time. No one left that meeting the same. The divisions between young and old, between those who had once been afraid and those who had long been angry, those walls came down. They all saw what needed to be done, and they saw it through the same eyes. Eyes that had witnessed violence, but also courage. Eyes that no longer looked away. The failed ambush had backfired. It hadn't broken the town. It had bound it tighter. And in that shared fire, a new strength was born. A turning point had arrived, and from that night forward, no one stood alone. The sun rose hot and sharp over Hollow Ridge, casting long shadows over fences that had been reinforced, trenches that had been dug by hand, and fields that now carried the weight of something far heavier than crops. The land had been changed, not just by fire or sabotage, but by resolve. Every corner of Malcolm Reed's farm had been transformed into a living defense, built by people who had finally drawn a line and dared anyone to cross it. And now, it was time to see if it would hold. From the ridge, the sound of engines rumbled louder than usual. Not the slow roll of a neighbor's pickup or the steady hum of farm machinery. This was different. Sharp. Aggressive. Jordan Lane spotted them first, 8 trucks barreling down the road, kicking up dust like a storm sweeping in. They were loaded heavy, packed with men in black clothing, some masked, some not bothering to hide. It was the Red Thorns, coming in force, not to scare anymore, but to finish what they had started. Malcolm didn't flinch. He stood at the front of the gate with nothing more than a staff in his hand and a knife at his side. His rifle was left behind on purpose. This wasn't about firepower. This was about standing ground with the truth. He gave the signal, and the community moved with practiced precision. Teens with radios scrambled into position, families took shelter, and patrol teams melted into the tree lines and brush, ready for what was coming. The Red Thorns charged through the fields, shouting threats and swinging weapons, their trucks pushing through gates and fences, expecting chaos and panic. But what they got was something entirely different. Powder traps exploded in their faces, blinding their eyes with chalk and pepper. Trenches stopped their vehicles cold. Noise traps set off chains of sound that echoed like thunder, throwing off their coordination. And when they stumbled forward, they didn't find defenseless civilians. They found a wall of resistance. Malcolm moved through the field like a man possessed. He didn't scream or swing wildly. Every step, every strike was deliberate. A crowbar came down, and he sidestepped, catching the attacker by the arm and dropping him with one sharp motion. Another came at him with a chain, only to be disarmed and knocked flat in seconds. Jordan was right there beside him, holding the line, not as a scared kid but as someone who had been shaped by the fight. Across the field, Ava helped coordinate defense near the schoolhouse, guiding families and young ones to safety. Pastor Carter stood in front of the church with a hammer in his hand, his stance quiet but firm. Lena knelt on the roof of the general store with her camera rolling, capturing every moment not for show, but for truth, to make sure the world saw what was really happening here. In the thick of the chaos, Darrell Hayes appeared like a shadow pulled from a nightmare. He moved with hate in his eyes, pushing through the smoke toward Malcolm, shouting curses, daring him to fight. When he pulled a pistol and raised it, Malcolm didn't back down. He walked forward slowly, eyes locked, not a hint of fear in his steps. Before Darrell could fire, Malcolm closed the distance, knocked the gun aside, and sent him crashing into the dirt. What followed wasn't clean. It wasn't easy. It was a raw, brutal fight between two men who represented everything this conflict had come to mean. The earth beneath them tore with each impact. Fists flew. Blood spilled. But in the end, it was Darrell who fell and didn't rise again. Not killed. Just broken. Beaten by a man who had fought wars across the world and refused to let this one destroy his home. The rest of the Red Thorns saw their leader down and began to scatter. Some surrendered. Others ran. But there was nowhere left to hide. The town had surrounded them. They had no backup, no power left to lean on. The people of Hollow Ridge stood shoulder to shoulder, not just to protect the land, but to say, with their presence alone, that hate had no place here. When the dust finally settled, and the last threat had faded into the distance, the people didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They stood quietly, taking in what they had just done. Not with pride, but with peace. Because they had defended their homes, their families, their future, and they had done it together. For the first time in a long time, Hollow Ridge felt unbreakable. In the days that followed the final assault, Hollow Ridge didn't return to normal. It stepped into something new. The smoke from the fires still lingered faintly in the air, and the fences bore the marks of battle, but the people moved with a quiet sense of purpose. They had survived something meant to break them, and now the question wasn't if they'd hold on, it was what came next. For Malcolm Reed, that meant making sure justice didn't end at the edge of the field. Lena Morris had everything ready. She'd gathered confessions, captured hours of video footage, and compiled documents that traced the entire operation, from the Red Thorns' violence to the forged land deeds and the money trail behind it all. It was a tangled web, but she laid it out clearly, piece by piece, until the full picture came into focus. At the center of it stood Darrell Hayes and Sheriff Alan Drake. One had led the attacks. The other had made sure the law stayed silent. They didn't expect it to go public. But Lena didn't hesitate. With Malcolm's blessing, she uploaded the evidence. The story spread fast. First through social media, then picked up by local news, and before long, it reached the state and national level. Reporters came with cameras, and officials who had ignored the community for years suddenly wanted to listen. The response was swift. State investigators showed up within days, taking over where the local authorities had failed. Arrests followed. Dozens of them. Some Red Thorns tried to run, disappearing into wooded cabins or skipping town in the dead of night, but they were found. Others stayed put, stunned by how quickly the tide had turned. The bravado they once wore like armor vanished as they were marched into vans, their faces pale with the realization that there would be no cover, no excuse, and no hiding anymore. Sheriff Drake was brought in under a cloud of flashing lights and cameras. He didn't say much as he was led out of the courthouse, hands cuffed in front of him, his badge removed. His expression wasn't angry. It was hollow. He knew it was over. And everyone watching knew it too. Darrell Hayes's trial came a few weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Malcolm sat in the second row, dressed simply, hands folded in his lap. He didn't testify. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. When the judge read the sentence, 25 years without parole, Darrell didn't look at anyone. He just stared ahead, eyes dull, as if he still couldn't believe he had lost to the people he once called powerless. Malcolm stood and walked out quietly when it was over. No words. No celebration. Just a man who had seen too much to treat justice like a show. Back in Hollow Ridge, things didn't suddenly get easier, but they did get clearer. The land still needed work. Fences still needed mending. Families still carried scars. But there was a sense of belonging now that hadn't existed before. People no longer nodded in passing. They stopped. They talked. They helped. The fear that had once lingered like fog had begun to lift. The old feed store, once nearly forgotten, was turned into something new, the Clara Reed Schoolhouse for Community Learning. Ava spearheaded the effort, organizing classes and events where children could learn the true history of their town and adults could find support and resources. Elders came in to tell stories. Lena recorded interviews. And Malcolm, when he wasn't working the land, would sometimes sit with the teens and teach them how to stay strong without ever raising their voice. One afternoon, Jordan came to see Malcolm. He said he was leaving to join the military, not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to protect. Malcolm didn't say much. Just looked him in the eye and told him to carry the truth with him, wherever he went. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The wounds began to heal. And in a small ceremony near the North Field, right where a burning cross had once scarred the soil, the community gathered to plant an oak tree. No speeches, just a quiet gathering, hands pressed to the earth. A stone was placed beside it with simple words etched into the surface. We are still here. Because they were. And now, the world knew it too. Winter eventually gave way to spring in Hollow Ridge, and with the thaw came something more than just warmer air. It was the quiet return of hope, carried in the smell of fresh soil, in the sight of new leaves budding on trees once blackened by smoke, and in the laughter of children chasing each other barefoot across the grass. Life had changed. The town had changed. And while not everything was perfect, what stood in the place of fear was something much stronger, community rooted in purpose. Malcolm Reed's farm no longer looked like a battleground. The fences had been mended. The barn was rebuilt with beams donated and raised by neighbors working side by side. The charred edges of the land had been cleared, replanted with crops that were already pushing through the earth. Every shovel full of dirt, every nail hammered into fresh boards, carried meaning. Not just survival, but something more lasting. A statement that no matter what had been done to them, they weren't leaving. They were rebuilding with intention. The farmhouse itself stood tall again, painted bright white, its porch sanded and sealed. Its beams were carved with initials from every neighbor who had come by to help, young and old, long-time locals and newcomers who had once stayed silent but were now ready to be counted. There were scars left behind, of course. Some parts of the land still grew patchy, grass struggling to return where the fire had scorched too deep. And some nights, folks still woke at the sound of a car engine, hearts beating a little too fast before they remembered it was safe. But the fear didn't hold the same grip it used to. What had replaced it was a quiet determination that wrapped around everything like roots under the soil, strong, unseen, and impossible to tear out. At the heart of town stood the Clara Reed Schoolhouse for Community Learning. It had once been the old feed store, but now it was filled with chalkboards, bookshelves, and the sound of young voices. Children of all backgrounds learned together inside those walls, taught not just to read and write, but to understand where they came from. They heard the stories that used to be whispered and forgotten. Stories of strength, of struggle, of people who stood their ground when it would have been easier to leave. Ava taught reading classes to adults in the evenings, while Lena organized storytelling nights where elders passed down memories and truth. Naomi's recordings played from time to time, soft voices of the past now carried into the future. Jordan Lane had gone. He left in the summer, just after the final harvest. He wore his grandmother's Bible in his coat and his resolve like a badge. The whole town gathered to see him off, not as a boy, but as a young man shaped by something larger than himself. Malcolm led the prayer that morning. His voice was steady, but his eyes told another story, a quiet pride, heavy with emotion, for all that had been lost and all that had been gained. Near the northern fence, where once the red thorns tried to plant fear, the oak tree had grown several feet taller. Its roots, invisible beneath the surface, had begun to spread wide and deep. The stone beside it remained untouched, its message as simple and powerful as the day it was placed. We are still here. People still came to touch it. Some to pray. Some just to remember. It wasn't about dwelling on pain, it was about honoring the strength it took to endure. And through it all, Malcolm kept walking his land every morning, coffee in hand, boots on dirt. Not because he was watching for trouble anymore, but because it was home. His pace had slowed some, the way age and experience gently insist it must. But his eyes still saw everything. The crops coming in. The kids running past the gate. The way folks waved longer now, not just in habit, but in connection. Hollow Ridge had been tested, burned, and nearly broken. But it hadn't fallen. It had risen. Not through vengeance, but through unity. Not in anger, but in truth. The legacy of what they had built, together, wasn't just in the buildings or the fields or the tree. It was in the hearts of the people who had chosen to stay, to fight with dignity, and to rebuild with purpose. And every time the wind rustled the leaves of that oak, it carried the same quiet message across the valley. They didn't win. We did. The story of Hollow Ridge offers timeless lessons that speak deeply to those who have weathered life's storms. It reminds us that strength doesn't always roar, it often stands quiet and steady in the face of injustice. Malcolm Reed didn't seek conflict, but when it came to his door, he chose to face it with honor, clarity, and unity. His calm leadership shows that true power lies not in aggression, but in purpose. For older audiences who have lived through times of change, loss, or resistance, this story echoes a familiar truth: community matters. When people come together with a shared commitment to protect what's right, they become stronger than hate, louder than fear, and more lasting than violence. We also learn that healing takes more than time. It takes effort, patience, and the willingness to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Whether it's standing up against wrong, nurturing the next generation, or simply choosing to stay when walking away seems easier, our everyday actions carry legacy. Let this story be a reminder that we are never too old to make a difference, and that resilience, no matter how quiet, leaves roots that can't be pulled out. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and let us know what lesson resonated most with you, or share your own story of standing strong. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more powerful, heartfelt stories just like this one.